Emily Carson froze mid-step, her 10-year-old frame suddenly rigid as stone in the scorching Texas heat. The German shepherd lay motionless in the tangle of rusty barbed wire, its matted fur caked with dried blood, sides barely moving with shallow breaths. This wasn't just any stray dog dying under the merciless summer sun. Grandpa Jim dropped his toolbox with a metallic clatter that echoed across the drought-stricken field, his weathered face draining of color as he rushed forward. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, kneeling beside the animal. A tiny whimper escaped the dog's throat as Emily inched closer, noticing the swollen teats hanging heavy beneath the emaciated body. Somewhere, puppies were waiting, hungry, alone, dying without their mother. "We have to help her now, Grandpa," Emily's voice cracked, her small hand reaching out despite the warning growl. "If we don't, they'll all die." How many hours remained before it would be too late? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Peterson family farm had seen better days. Once spanning nearly 200 acres of fertile Texas soil, it had dwindled to 50 acres of sun-baked earth that seemed to grow more dust than crops. The white farmhouse, with its sagging porch and weathered clapboards, stood as a testament to both stubborn resilience and inevitable decline, much like its owners. Jim Peterson, at 68, moved with the deliberate care of a man whose body had endured more than its fair share of hardship. His hands, permanently stained and calloused from decades of work, still possessed the surprising gentleness that had made him a respected Army veterinarian during the Vietnam War, the same conflict that had left him with a slight limp and nightmares he never discussed. Martha Peterson's once auburn hair had faded to a soft silver that she kept neatly pinned back while she worked. At 65, her face carried the fine lines of a woman who had weathered grief with grace. The loss of their infant son decades ago had left a quiet shadow in her eyes that never fully disappeared. She compensated with practical efficiency, managing their dwindling resources with the precision of a general planning a last stand. Emily Carson was the unexpected light in their increasingly difficult lives. Robert Carson had sent his daughter to stay with her grandparents for the summer, ostensibly to give her fresh country air after a series of severe asthma attacks. But the adults recognized it for what it was: Robert struggling to parent alone since his wife Caroline's death from cancer 2 years earlier. Emily had inherited her mother's chestnut hair and delicate features, but beneath her fragile appearance lay a determined spirit. She carried an old Polaroid camera everywhere, documenting everything from wildflowers to fence posts, creating a world she could control through her viewfinder. She rarely spoke about her mother, but Martha often found her sitting in the porch swing, studying the photograph of Caroline that she kept tucked in her pocket. "The bank man came again," Martha had whispered to Jim the previous evening after Emily had gone to bed. "Says we've got until the end of summer before they foreclose." Jim had simply nodded, the weight of potential failure pressing down on shoulders already bent from decades of hard work. 3 generations of Petersons had worked this land. He might be the last. Maybe Robert could help, Martha had suggested without much hope. The rift between father and son had widened after Robert moved to Houston, choosing city life over farming. "We'll manage," Jim had answered, the same response he'd given to every crisis since returning from Vietnam. Now, as Jim carried the injured German shepherd toward the barn with Emily hovering anxiously beside him, Martha stood in the doorway, arms crossed, another mouth to feed. Another responsibility they couldn't afford. Yet the look on her granddaughter's face, the first real spark of purpose she'd shown all summer, made Martha hold her tongue. Sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms, even ones with 4 paws and a matted coat. "She needs antibiotics, clean water, and rest," Jim said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone that had commanded respect during his military days. He gently laid the German Shepherd on a bed of clean straw in the corner of the barn. The dog's breathing was shallow, her once powerful body now thin and broken. Emily hovered close by, her small face tight with worry. "Will she live, Grandpa?" Jim didn't believe in lying to children. "I don't know, sweetheart. She's lost a lot of blood and that infection is bad, but she's fighting." Martha appeared in the barn doorway, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval that softened slightly when she saw the dog's condition. "Land's sakes, she's in a sorry state." She set down the basin of warm water and clean rags she'd brought from the house. "Don't get your hopes up, Emily, and don't name her." Too late. Emily was already kneeling beside the injured animal, her voice a gentle whisper. "Your name is Faith." "Because that's what we need right now." Jim exchanged a look with Martha. They both recognized the dangerous attachment forming, dangerous because there was a strong chance the dog wouldn't survive the night, and Emily had already experienced too much loss for her young years. "I'll fetch my old kit," Jim said, rising stiffly. His veterinary supplies were limited, most well past their expiration dates, but they were better than nothing. Martha lingered, watching Emily stroke the dog's head with feather-light touches. "This isn't a stray, Emily. This dog belonged to someone. German shepherds are expensive animals." "Then why was she caught in a fence? Why is she so skinny?" Emily challenged, a flash of her mother's spirit showing through. Caroline had never backed down either. "Whoever had her before didn't take care of her," Martha sighed. "Just remember she might have owners looking for her." As Martha returned to the house, Jim came back with a battered metal box, his field kit from Vietnam. He opened it on the barn floor, revealing neatly organized compartments of medicines, bandages, and surgical tools. "I haven't used this in years," he admitted, "but I kept it stocked out of habit." Emily watched intently as Jim cleaned the dog's wounds, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. The worst injury was a deep gash where the barbed wire had cut into her hind leg, the flesh around it hot and swollen with infection. "She's been dragging herself for miles," Jim said, gently probing the wound. "Strong girl." Faith whimpered but didn't snap or growl. Her eyes, deep amber pools of pain and exhaustion, remained fixed on Emily as if measuring whether these humans could be trusted. "Look, Grandpa." Emily pointed to Faith's swollen teats. "She has babies somewhere." Jim nodded grimly. "And they won't survive long without her. Newborn pups need their mother's milk and warmth." Emily's eyes widened with urgency. "We have to find them. How do we find them, Grandpa?" Jim glanced out the barn door at the lengthening shadows. The Texas summer sun was beginning its descent, painting the drought-stricken landscape in amber hues. In the distance, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, the summer storm the radio had been warning about all day. "We follow her trail backward," he said. "She left blood and fur on the fence where we found her. We can track from there, see where she came from." Emily was already on her feet. "Let's go now." Jim placed a restraining hand on her shoulder. "First, we get Faith stabilized. I need to clean these wounds, give her antibiotics, and get some fluids in her. Then we'll find those puppies." For the next hour, Jim worked methodically. He cleaned Faith's wounds with antiseptic, administered a carefully measured dose of penicillin from his dwindling supply, and set up a makeshift IV drip using saline solution and tubing from his old field kit. Emily assisted silently, handing him supplies, holding Faith's head, and murmuring reassurances when the dog whimpered in pain. Martha returned with a bowl of watered-down beef broth. "This is all we can spare," she said, her practical nature asserting itself despite the softening in her eyes when she saw Emily's dedication. "It's perfect, Martha. Thank you." Jim took the bowl gratefully. He'd known his wife long enough to recognize when her practical exterior was giving way to her compassionate heart. Martha knelt beside Emily, placing a weathered hand on the girl's thin shoulder. "Your mama would be proud of how you're helping this dog, child." Emily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. It was the first time Martha had mentioned Caroline directly since Emily's arrival at the farm. The acknowledgment of her mother's absence and approval in the same breath was both painful and comforting. "She looks like the dog in the picture with Mom," Emily said softly. "The one from when she was little." Jim and Martha exchanged surprised glances. Caroline had indeed had a German shepherd as a child. Max, if Jim remembered correctly. The coincidence tightened his throat. "That's right," Martha said. "Your mama loved that dog something fierce." While Faith lapped weakly at the broth, Jim outlined their plan to find the puppies. "We need to move quick, before that storm hits. Tommy from the neighboring farm might help us. He's good at tracking." "I'll call him," Martha offered, heading back to the house to use the phone. Jim checked Faith's vital signs again. Her pulse was rapid but strong, and though her temperature was elevated from the infection, she seemed more alert after the medicine and fluids. "You're a survivor, aren't you, girl?" he murmured, scratching behind her ear. Faith's tail thumped weakly against the straw in response. Tommy Miller arrived 20 minutes later on his bike, excitement written all over his freckled 13-year-old face. The prospect of a tracking mission was irresistible to a boy who spent most of his summer days bored and restless on his parents' equally struggling farm. "Mom says I gotta be home before the storm hits," he announced, peering curiously at Faith. "Whoa, she's in rough shape. That's why we need to find her puppies fast," Emily explained. "They'll die without her." The gravity of the situation sobered Tommy immediately. "Let's go then." Jim grabbed a flashlight, a canvas bag, and a canteen of water. "Martha, keep an eye on Faith. If she tries to get up, stop her." "She'll tear those stitches and we'll be back to square one." Martha nodded, settling onto a hay bale with her mending basket. "Be careful, all of you. That storm's coming in faster than they said on the radio." The small search party retraced their steps to where they'd found Faith trapped in the fence. From there, Jim studied the ground, looking for signs of the dog's passage. Years of tracking in Vietnam had honed skills he hadn't used in decades. "There!" He pointed to a faint disturbance in the dry earth, speckled with dark drops of blood. "She came from this direction." They followed the trail across the parched field, through a dry creek bed, and toward a grove of ancient oak trees that marked the boundary between the Peterson farm and wilderness beyond. The blood trail became fainter as they went, indicating that Faith's wounds had likely been less severe when she started her journey. "How far could she have come, Grandpa?" Emily asked, panting slightly in the humid air. "German shepherds are incredibly determined, especially mothers protecting their young," Jim replied. "She could have traveled miles." Tommy suddenly stopped, pointing at something on the ground. "Look! Paw prints!" Sure enough, clear canine tracks were visible in a patch of softer soil, heading directly toward the largest oak in the grove. As they approached the massive tree, Jim noticed a hollow at its base, partially hidden by overgrown roots and brush. "This could be it," he said quietly. "Emily, stay back. If there are puppies in there, they might be frightened or even aggressive." Emily ignored him, stepping forward with determination. "They'll smell their mother on me," she said, kneeling by the hollow. "Hello? Puppies? We're here to help you." A faint, whimpering sound emerged from the darkness of the hollow. "They're in there!" Emily cried, already beginning to crawl toward the opening. Jim grabbed her arm. "Hold on, Emily. We don't know how stable that hollow is or what else might be in there." "But they need help now," Emily protested, her voice rising with urgency. "You said they wouldn't survive long without their mother." Tommy dropped to his stomach and peered into the hollow with his flashlight. "I can see movement in there, Mr. Peterson. Definitely something alive." Jim weighed their options. The hollow looked barely big enough for Emily to crawl through, certainly too small for him. The storm clouds were gathering more quickly now, the distant rumble of thunder warning of the approaching deluge. "All right," he conceded reluctantly. "But Emily, you go in just far enough to see what's there, then come right back out to report. No heroics." Emily nodded solemnly, though the determined set of her jaw reminded Jim painfully of Caroline. His daughter had never been one to leave a rescue mission incomplete either. "Be careful, Em," Tommy said, handing her his flashlight. Emily took a deep breath and began to crawl into the hollow, the beam of light illuminating her path into the darkness beneath the ancient oak. The hollow beneath the oak tree smelled of earth, rotting leaves, and something else, a warm animal musk that grew stronger as Emily crawled deeper. The flashlight beam caught motes of dust dancing in the air, illuminating a tunnel that widened slightly after the narrow entrance. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat seeming to whisper, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." "I see something," she called back, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Ahead, the beam of light revealed a small chamber where the tree's roots had created a natural den. And there, huddled together in a nest of dried grass and what looked like scraps of fabric, were 3 tiny puppies. Emily gasped. They were so small, eyes barely open, bodies hardly bigger than her hand. Their fur was the same rich tan and black as Faith's, though softer and fluffier. As she inched closer, they began to whimper and squirm, tiny pink mouths opening in hunger. "There are 3 puppies," she called back to her grandfather and Tommy. "They're alive!" She heard Jim's relieved sigh. "Can you reach them? Be gentle. They're fragile." Emily moved forward carefully. The puppies' movements became more frantic as they caught her scent, perhaps hoping she was their mother returning with food. She gently touched one, marveling at the softness of its fur. It squirmed against her finger, seeking warmth and nourishment she couldn't provide. As she shifted to gather them, her light swept across a darker corner of the den, her breath caught in her throat. There was a 4th puppy, lying motionless apart from the others. "Grandpa," she called, her voice cracking. "There's another one, but I think it's—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word. Instead, she reached out with trembling fingers to touch the still form. The puppy was cold, its little body stiff and unresponsive. Emily felt tears welling in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in hot trails. "Emily?" Jim's concerned voice reached her. "What's wrong?" "One of them didn't make it," she managed to say, the words catching in her throat. Outside the hollow, Jim closed his eyes briefly, feeling the familiar weight of death that had followed him since Vietnam. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Sometimes nature is cruel." Thunder rumbled closer now, and a few fat raindrops began to fall, pattering against the leaves overhead. "We need to get those living pups back to their mother," Jim called. "Can you bring them out?" Emily wiped her tears with a dirty hand, leaving a smudge across her cheek. "Yes." She carefully gathered the 3 surviving puppies, cradling them against her chest. They were so light, so fragile. As an afterthought, she reached back for the dead puppy, unwilling to leave it alone in the dark. "I'm coming out," she called, shuffling backward through the tunnel, protecting her precious cargo with her body. When she emerged into the fading daylight, Tommy gasped at the tiny creatures in her arms. Jim knelt beside her, his weathered face solemn as he inspected the puppies. "They're dehydrated," he said, gently examining one, "but they're fighters, just like their mama." Emily held out the still puppy, her lower lip trembling. "This one didn't make it." Jim took the tiny body with reverence, cradling it in his large, calloused palm. The contrast between his battle-hardened hands and the delicate puppy made Emily's heart ache even more. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said softly. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we can't save everything." The words hung in the air, carrying more weight than just the loss of a puppy. Emily knew he was thinking of all the things he couldn't save. Animals during the war, her grandmother's infant son, perhaps even her mother. Tommy shifted uncomfortably, sensing the heaviness of the moment. "We should hurry," he said, pointing to the darkening sky. "That storm's almost here." Jim nodded, carefully wrapping the deceased puppy in his handkerchief and placing it in his pocket. "Let's get these little ones back to their mother." They hurried back across the field, Emily and Tommy taking turns carrying the canvas bag now serving as a makeshift carrier for the puppies. The wind had picked up, bending the dried grasses and sending dust devils spinning across the barren ground. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the rumbling growl of thunder. "Go on home, Tommy," Jim told the boy as they reached the fence line. "Your mama will be worried with this storm coming." Tommy hesitated, clearly torn between responsibility to his family and desire to see the reunion between Faith and her puppies. "Will you let me know how they do, Mr. Peterson?" "First thing tomorrow," Jim promised. "You did good work today, son." Pride flashed across Tommy's freckled face before he jumped on his bike, pedaling hard toward his family's farm a half-mile down the road. Jim and Emily hurried the rest of the way to the barn, the first real raindrops beginning to fall in earnest now, pelting their shoulders and heads. By the time they reached the barn door, they were both damp, and the puppies were squirming anxiously in the bag, their high-pitched whines growing more insistent. Martha looked up from her seat beside Faith, her hands pausing in their mending. "You found them?" Emily nodded, breathless with excitement and anxiety. "3 of them. One," her voice faltered. "One didn't make it," Jim finished for her, closing the barn door against the intensifying storm. Martha's face softened with understanding. "Nature can be cruel, child, but you saved 3? That's something to be proud of." Faith had raised her head at their entrance, her amber eyes alert despite her weakened state. When she heard the puppy's whimpers, she tried to stand, her instinct to reach her young overriding her pain. "Easy, girl," Jim soothed, gently pressing her back down. "We're bringing them to you." Emily carefully removed the puppies from the bag, cradling them in her arms. "What if she doesn't recognize them?" she whispered, suddenly afraid. "What if our scent confuses her?" Martha's hand settled on her shoulder. "A mother knows her babies, Emily. Have faith." The word, the dog's new name, hung in the air like a prayer. Emily knelt beside Faith, holding the puppies where she could see and smell them. The German shepherd's nose twitched, her eyes fixed on the tiny bundles. For a moment that stretched into eternity, no one breathed. Then Faith whined softly, a sound of recognition and longing that broke the tension. Emily carefully placed the first puppy beside her, then the second, then the third. Faith immediately began to sniff them, then lick them clean with long, gentle strokes of her tongue. The puppies, recognizing their mother's scent and warmth, began to squirm toward her belly, instinctively seeking nourishment. Faith shifted to accommodate them, wincing slightly at the movement but determined to care for her young. "Look at that," Martha whispered, her eyes suspiciously bright. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways." Outside, the storm unleashed its fury, rain lashing against the barn's tin roof in a deafening tattoo. Inside, in the warm glow of the lantern Jim had lit, a miracle of reunion unfolded. The puppies found their mother's teats and began to nurse, their tiny bodies relaxing in contentment. Faith's eyes drifted closed, her face peaceful despite her injuries. Emily sat cross-legged beside them, her face glowing with a joy Jim hadn't seen since before Caroline's illness. The loss of the 4th puppy was still there, a shadow behind her eyes, but it was tempered by the victory of saving 3. "What will we name them?" she asked, looking up at her grandparents. Jim and Martha exchanged glances. Naming meant attachment, and attachment meant Emily would be heartbroken when they inevitably had to find homes for the puppies, or worse, if Faith didn't survive her injuries. But looking at Emily's face, alight with purpose for the first time in months, Jim couldn't bring himself to deny her this moment of happiness. "What do you think they should be called?" he asked. Emily considered the puppies thoughtfully. "Hope, Love, and Courage," she decided, pointing to each in turn. "Because that's what Faith gave them by bringing them into the world, and what she showed getting back to them." Martha's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes meeting Jim's over Emily's head. Those had been the names of Caroline's childhood dolls, names Emily couldn't possibly remember being told. "Those are perfect names," Jim said, his voice rough with emotion. As the storm raged outside, Faith opened her eyes briefly, looking directly at Emily, with a gaze that seemed too intelligent, too knowing for a mere animal. Then she sighed deeply and returned to resting while her puppies nursed. Jim checked Faith's temperature and found it elevated. The infection was worsening despite the antibiotics he'd administered. The puppies would drain her limited strength further. She needed stronger medicine than his outdated supplies could provide. "What's wrong, Grandpa?" Emily asked, noticing his frown. "Faith needs better antibiotics," he admitted. "What I gave her might not be enough to fight the infection." "Then we'll get them," Emily said with the simple certainty of childhood. Jim exchanged a look with Martha. The nearest veterinary clinic was in town, 30 miles away. It would be closed at this hour, and even if it weren't, they barely had gas money, let alone funds for expensive medications. "We'll figure something out in the morning," Jim said, not wanting to burden Emily with adult worries. "For now, Faith needs rest, and so do you." But Emily, with a perception beyond her years, understood the unspoken concern. "Is it because of money? Dad says you and Grandma are having money troubles." Martha's face tightened. "Your father shouldn't be discussing such things with you." "I'm not a baby," Emily protested. "I know things are hard, but we have to help Faith. She didn't give up on her puppies even when she was hurt." "We can't give up on her." Jim looked at his granddaughter, so like Caroline in her fierce determination, and felt something shift inside him. For years he'd been slowly surrendering to defeat. The failing farm, the mounting bills, the inexorable march of time wearing down his body and spirit. But in Emily's eyes he saw a reflection of his younger self, the man who had once believed that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. "You're right," he said, straightening his shoulders. "We don't give up on family, and Faith is family now." The declaration settled over the barn like a blessing, more powerful than the storm that continued to rage outside. In that moment, a pact was sealed, one that would change all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The days following the rescue of Faith and her puppies fell into a rhythm as natural and necessary as breathing. Emily woke before dawn each morning, hurrying to the barn to check on the small family. Faith's condition improved slowly, too slowly for Jim's comfort, but the determined German shepherd fought the infection with a stubborn will that matched Emily's own. Martha had fashioned a comfortable bed from old quilts that she claimed were too worn for the house anyway, though Emily had seen those same quilts on the guest bed just days before. The contradiction between Martha's practical words and generous actions made Emily smile. Adults were strange that way, saying one thing while their hearts said another. "Good morning, Faith," Emily whispered on the 5th day, settling beside the dog with the notebook she'd begun keeping. In it, she recorded Faith's temperature, appetite, and the puppy's development with a scientist's precision. Jim had taught her how to check vital signs, showing her how to feel for the pulse point beneath the dog's jaw, how to check gum color for signs of improved circulation. Faith's tail thumped weakly against the quilts, her amber eyes following Emily with intelligence and growing trust. The puppies, now with their eyes fully open, squirmed and yipped, demanding their morning feeding. "They're getting stronger," Jim observed, appearing in the barn doorway with a mug of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. And louder, Emily grinned, lifting Hope, the smallest puppy, for a closer inspection. Their eyes are changing color. They were blue yesterday, but now they're starting to look more like Faith's. Jim nodded, kneeling with a slight wince to examine the mother dog. His hands moved methodically, checking the healing wounds, feeling for fever. "The infection's finally retreating," he confirmed. That last round of antibiotics from Doc Williams did the trick. The local veterinarian had been another unexpected blessing. When Jim had finally swallowed his pride and called about purchasing antibiotics, Dr. Williams had insisted on driving out to the farm himself, refusing payment when he saw Faith's condition. "Consider it professional courtesy, one vet to another," he'd said, waving away Jim's protests. "Besides, I owe you. That advice you gave me about Mrs. Henderson's prize mare last spring saved me considerable embarrassment." Emily knew the donation had wounded her grandfather's pride, but necessity had overcome his reluctance to accept charity. As she watched him check Faith's temperature now, she saw something else in his movements. A renewed sense of purpose and confidence. Working with animals again seemed to have awoken something that had been dormant for too long. "Breakfast in 15 minutes, Martha called from the house. "Emily, wash up properly before you come in. You smell like barn." Emily rolled her eyes but smiled. Her grandmother's complaints had lost their edge lately, softened by the way Martha herself spent hours in the barn, crocheting beside Faith while murmuring stories about Caroline as a girl. "Can I bring Faith some eggs?" Emily called back. A pause, then, "I suppose, but use the cracked ones." Emily knew there were no cracked eggs. Martha had been setting aside the best ones for Faith all week, claiming they would build her strength faster than that dry kibble. After breakfast, Emily settled on a hay bale with her mother's favorite book, The Secret Garden, and continued reading aloud where she'd left off the day before. Faith listened with her head resting on her paws, eyes alert despite her weakened state. "I think she understands the story," Emily told Jim when he returned from fixing a section of fence damaged in the storm. "She gets excited when I read about Dickon training the animals." Jim smiled, not dismissing the idea outright as Emily had feared. "Dogs understand more than most people give them credit for," he said, scratching Faith behind the ears. "Especially German shepherds. They're intelligent, loyal to a fault, and have an uncanny sense about people." "Is that why you had one in Vietnam?" Emily asked. She'd seen the faded photograph tucked in her grandfather's wallet, a younger Jim with a German shepherd wearing a military vest. Jim's expression changed, a shadow passing across his features. "Rex," he said after a moment. "Best partner I ever had. He saved my unit more times than I can count, detecting mines, alerting us to ambushes." He fell silent, lost in memories. "What happened to him?" Emily asked softly. Jim swallowed hard. "He died, doing his job, protecting us." The simple epitaph carried a weight of grief, still fresh decades later. Emily looked at Faith, understanding better now why her grandfather had been so willing to help the injured dog. "Faith is brave like Rex," she said. "Yes," Jim agreed, his voice rough. Cut from the same cloth. The puppies had begun to venture from their mother's side, wobbling on uncertain legs as they explored the small world of their nest. Love, the largest puppy with a distinctive white patch on his chest, was the boldest, already attempting to climb over the low barrier Jim had constructed around their bed. Hope remained the smallest, but had a determined streak that reminded Emily of herself. Courage, with his perfectly symmetrical facial markings, seemed the most attentive to human voices, his head tilting whenever Emily or Jim spoke. "They'll need homes eventually," Martha remarked one evening as the family sat on the porch, watching a spectacular sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple. The puppies were nestled in a basket at Emily's feet, Faith resting nearby, her healing legs stretched carefully before her. The statement, practical as always, fell like a stone into the peaceful moment. Emily's heart constricted at the thought of separating the family she'd helped save. "Not yet," she protested. "They're too young." "Of course not yet," Martha agreed. "But German Shepherd puppies will fetch a good price once they're weaned. Might help with the mortgage payment." Jim's hand found Emily's shoulder, a gentle pressure of reassurance. "We'll cross that bridge when we come to it," he said, a subtle rebuke in his tone that silenced further discussion, but Emily understood the reality behind Martha's words. The bank notice had arrived that morning. Impossible to miss the bold red lettering through the thin envelope. 2 months remained before foreclosure. The small family celebration over Faith's improving health had been marred by the weight of Jim's silence after reading the letter. Later that night, unable to sleep, Emily slipped from the house and made her way to the barn. The nearly full moon illuminated her path across the yard, casting long shadows from the oak trees that lined the property. Inside, Faith raised her head alertly at Emily's entrance, relaxing only when she recognized the familiar scent and footsteps. "I won't let them separate you," Emily whispered, settling beside the dog and drawing her knees to her chest. "I promise." Faith sighed, resting her head on Emily's lap with a trust that brought tears to the girl's eyes. Emily stroked the dog's head, finding comfort in the rhythmic motion and Faith's solid warmth. "I miss my mom," Emily confessed in the darkness, words she couldn't bring herself to speak in daylight. "Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like." "Dad put away all her pictures except one because he said it hurt too much to see them. But I think forgetting hurts worse." Faith's amber eyes reflected the moonlight streaming through the barn window, steady and attentive. In that gaze, Emily found something she'd been missing since her mother's death: complete acceptance and understanding without judgment or uncomfortable platitudes. "When I found you, I felt like maybe Mom sent you," Emily continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sounds stupid, doesn't it? But you have the same eyes as the dog in her childhood photo. And you needed me as much as I needed you." Faith's tail thumped once against the blankets, as if in agreement. Emily pulled her mother's photograph from her pocket. Caroline at 10, the same age Emily was now, with a German Shepherd puppy in her arms. The resemblance between that puppy and Faith's own offspring was striking. Perhaps that explained the immediate connection Emily had felt with Faith, some genetic memory passed down through generations of both humans and dogs. "Emily?" Jim's voice came softly from the barn entrance. "Couldn't sleep?" Startled, Emily wiped hastily at her eyes. "I was just checking on Faith." Jim moved to sit beside her, his joints creaking in protest. "She's doing well. You've done a fine job caring for her." The simple praise warmed Emily more than elaborate compliments would have. Jim wasn't one for unnecessary words. "I was telling Faith about Mom," Emily admitted, showing him the photograph. Jim studied it in the dim light, his finger tracing Caroline's smiling face. "She loved that pup. Max was his name. Your grandmother thought having a dog would teach Caroline responsibility." A smile touched his lips. "Instead, Caroline taught that dog to raid the cookie jar and blame the neighbor's cat." Emily laughed, a sound that seemed to startle them both with its unexpected brightness. "Really?" "Oh, yes. Your mother was quite the little schemer when she set her mind to something." Jim's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You remind me of her sometimes, especially when you get that determined look." They sat in comfortable silence, Faith's steady breathing the only sound in the peaceful darkness. After a while, Jim spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "I've been thinking about Faith's training." "What training?" Emily asked. She responds to commands, subtle ones. Yesterday, when Tommy came running into the barn, shouting about finding a snake by the creek, Faith went on alert. Her posture changed completely. A normal dog might have barked or cowered, but Faith positioned herself between the perceived threat and her puppies. That's protection training. Emily frowned. You mean someone trained her specially? Jim nodded. And there's something else. When I was checking her teeth today, I noticed distinctive wear patterns, the kind you see in dogs trained to carry and retrieve objects regularly. Plus, she responds to hand signals I haven't taught her. He hesitated. Emily, I think Faith might be a service dog or even a military working dog. Like Rex? Emily's eyes widened. Possibly, which means she might have an owner looking for her, someone who invested considerable time and resources in her training. Emily's stomach knotted with sudden fear. But if she was so valuable, why was she half-starved? Why was she caught in a fence all alone? Jim had no answer, but his frown deepened. I don't know, sweetheart, but someone trained this dog and they trained her well. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Emily was in the barn helping Jim change Faith's bandages when the sound of tires on gravel drew their attention. Through the open barn door, they watched a dusty pickup truck with an unfamiliar logo pull into the yard. Peterson Farm? Called a man in his 30s, climbing from the driver's seat. He wore jeans and a polo shirt with the same logo as the truck. Miller Pharmaceuticals. Jim stepped outside, instinctively positioning himself between the stranger and the barn where Faith and her puppies rested. Can I help you? The man approached with an easy smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Name's Steve Miller. I'm looking for a dog that went missing about 3 months ago. A female German Shepherd. He pulled a photograph from his back pocket. My company uses trained dogs for various purposes, and this one wandered off during a training exercise near here. Emily had followed her grandfather outside, staying slightly behind him as the stranger spoke. When Steve held out the photograph, she felt her heart sink. The dog in the image was undeniably Faith, thinner than she was now, but with the same distinctive markings. We haven't seen any stray dogs, Jim said, his voice neutral. Emily glanced at him in surprise, then understood his caution. Something about Steve Miller's story didn't ring true. Steve's smile tightened. She's microchipped and registered, worth quite a bit to my company. If you hear anything. He handed Jim a business card. There's a reward. After Steve drove away, Jim stared at the business card for a long moment before tucking it into his shirt pocket. I don't like it, he said finally. If Faith is his dog, why did we find her half-starved and injured miles from anywhere? And why wait 3 months to come looking? Emily hugged herself, suddenly cold despite the summer heat. We can't give her back to him, Grandpa. We just can't. Jim's expression was troubled as he looked toward the horizon where dust still rose from Steve Miller's departing truck. Let's not borrow trouble, Emily, but I think I'll make some calls about Miller Pharmaceuticals. That evening, the puppies ventured outside for the first time. Faith watched from the barn doorway as her offspring explored the small fenced area Jim had prepared, her alert gaze following their every move. Emily sat cross-legged in the grass, laughing as Courage attempted to climb into her lap, his oversized paws skidding on the denim of her overalls. They're growing so fast, Martha observed, surprising Emily by joining her on the ground, her usual concern for clean clothes apparently forgotten. Love is almost twice Hope's size now, Emily agreed, watching the largest puppy confidently investigating a butterfly that had landed on a nearby dandelion. Martha's hand settled on Emily's shoulder. You know we can't keep them all, don't you, child? Emily nodded reluctantly. I know, but we can make sure they go to good homes. People who will love them and take care of them properly. Of course we will, Martha assured her. And maybe, She hesitated, exchanging a glance with Jim, who had emerged from the barn. Maybe we could keep one. A farm needs a good dog. Emily's heart leaped. Really? Can we keep Faith, too? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as Jim's expression clouded. The specter of Steve Miller's visit and the financial reality of their situation loomed over the peaceful family scene like the gathering storm clouds on the distant horizon. 3 weeks after Faith's rescue, the Peterson farm vibrated with tension like an over-tightened guitar string. The puppies, now rambunctious bundles of energy exploring every corner of the barn, remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around them. Faith, however, sensed it. Her amber eyes tracked the human's movements with increasing vigilance, and she'd taken to positioning herself between her puppies and the barn door whenever unfamiliar vehicles approached. "He's back," Martha announced from the kitchen window, her voice tight. The now familiar pickup truck with the Miller Pharmaceuticals logo kicked up dust as it rolled down the long driveway toward the farmhouse. Emily, helping her grandmother shell peas, felt her stomach clench. Steve Miller had returned twice more since his first visit, each time with a more elaborate story about Faith's importance to his company's research program. Each time, Jim had politely but firmly maintained they hadn't seen any German shepherd matching his description. "Go to the barn," Jim instructed Emily, rising from the kitchen table where he'd been repairing an ancient clock radio. "Stay with Faith and the puppies. Don't come out until I call for you." Emily nodded, slipping out the back door and circling behind the house to avoid being seen. From inside the barn, she peered through a crack in the wooden planks, watching as Steve Miller exited his truck and approached her grandfather with the false smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Peterson," Steve called with exaggerated friendliness. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Jim stood on the porch steps, arms crossed. "What can I do for you, Mr. Miller?" Steve held up a manila folder. "I've brought documentation this time, proof of ownership for the dog I'm looking for." His smile hardened. "And I've brought Sheriff Daniels with me." Emily's breath caught as a police cruiser pulled up behind the pickup truck. The sheriff, a heavy-set man with a perpetually sunburned face whom Emily had met at the town's 4th of July picnic, stepped out, adjusting his hat against the harsh Texas sun. "Jim," the sheriff nodded, his expression uncomfortable. "Got a complaint here about a missing dog. Valuable property, according to Mr. Miller." Jim's posture remained unyielding. "As I've told Mr. Miller multiple times, we haven't seen any stray German shepherd." Steve's smile vanished entirely. "With all due respect, Mr. Peterson, I have reason to believe that's not true." He pulled a photograph from his folder. "One of your neighbors mentioned seeing a German shepherd on your property, a female, with puppies." Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. Who had told him? Tommy's family. The Wilsons down the road. She thought of Faith, finally healthy enough to venture into the sunshine with her puppies, visible to anyone passing on the main road. "Sheriff," Jim said, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders, "may I see this supposed proof of ownership?" Sheriff Daniels gestured for Steve to hand over the folder, which he did with obvious reluctance. Jim opened it, studying the contents with a frown that deepened as he turned each page. "These registration papers show the dog's name as Bella," Jim observed. "Microchip number 457892, purchased from Elite K9 Training Center in Houston 3 years ago." "That's correct," Steve said smugly. "She's a valuable research animal." "Research for what exactly?" Jim asked, looking up from the papers. Steve's expression tightened. "That's proprietary information. Miller Pharmaceuticals has numerous research programs, all properly licensed and regulated." Jim handed the folder to Sheriff Daniels. "If this dog is microchipped, any vet can scan and confirm ownership." "Exactly," Steve agreed quickly. "So if you have the dog, we can resolve this immediately." Sheriff Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "Jim, if you've got someone's property, the right thing to do is return it." Jim's eyes narrowed slightly. Sheriff, you've known me for 30 years. When have I ever been dishonest with you? The sheriff had the grace to look embarrassed. Never, Jim. But Mr. Miller here has documentation and I have concerns, Jim interrupted firmly. If this dog is so valuable, why did it take 3 months to come looking for her? And why would a pharmaceutical company need a trained German shepherd? Something doesn't add up. Steve's face flushed with anger. My company's business is none of your concern. That dog is company property, and withholding her is theft. Now hold on. Sheriff Daniels raised a hand. No one's accusing anyone of theft. Jim, if you do have a German shepherd here, we should verify if it's Mr. Miller's dog. Emily watched her grandfather struggle with the decision, his weathered face creased with worry. Finally, he sighed. Martha, would you fetch Emily from the barn, please? Martha, who had been silently observing from the doorway, gave Jim a sharp look before nodding and heading toward the barn. Moments later, she appeared at Emily's side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Your grandfather wants you, child, she said softly. Be brave. Emily followed her grandmother outside, heart pounding. Faith would be visible through the open barn door to anyone looking in that direction. Had she just been hiding the dog in plain sight all along? Emily, Jim called, gesturing her forward. Mr. Miller believes we may have found his lost dog. He has papers for a German shepherd named Bella. Emily approached slowly, avoiding Steve's gaze. The dog we found was hurt really bad, she said, her voice small but clear. She was caught in a fence and starving. Steve's expression flickered. That would explain her disappearance. She must have run off during a thunderstorm and gotten lost. Bella was always afraid of thunder. Something about the statement rang false to Emily, though she couldn't articulate why. Faith had remained calm during several thunderstorms since her rescue, watching the lightning flash through the barn windows without visible distress. If you found her 3 weeks ago, she should be recovered by now, Steve continued. I'd like to see her. Jim placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. Sheriff, before we proceed, I'd like to make a formal request. If this is indeed Mr. Miller's dog, I want a licensed veterinarian to examine her condition. The animal we found was severely malnourished and had injuries inconsistent with simply being caught in a fence. Sheriff Daniels frowned. What are you suggesting, Jim? I'm suggesting that if this dog was mistreated, there may be legal implications regarding animal cruelty. Steve's face darkened. This is ridiculous. You're stalling. No, Jim replied evenly. I'm ensuring the welfare of an animal, which was my job for 20 years in the Army Veterinary Corps. If Bella is your dog and was properly cared for, you should have no objection to a vet examination. The sheriff considered this, then nodded. Seems reasonable. Doc Williams can meet us here in about an hour. In the meantime, I'd like to see this dog you found. Emily felt cold dread settle in her stomach as her grandfather led the small group toward the barn. Inside, Faith had already positioned herself protectively in front of her puppies, her ears forward, body tense with alertness. When Steve appeared in the doorway, her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. A low, threatening growl rumbled from her chest, her hackles rising. That's Bella, Steve confirmed, his voice tight. She's always been temperamental. Emily moved instinctively to Faith's side, placing a calming hand on the dog's shoulder. It's okay, Faith, she murmured, though the dog's continued growling suggested otherwise. Sheriff Daniels observed the scene with a frown. She doesn't seem particularly happy to see you, Mr. Miller. She's been away for months, Steve dismissed, and she's always been protective of her handlers. Once she's back at the facility, she'll remember her training. Jim knelt beside Faith, checking her reaction. The dog stopped growling at his touch, but remained rigid, her eyes never leaving Steve. These puppies are about 3 weeks old, Jim noted. which means she was already pregnant when she disappeared from your facility. Steve shrugged. Obviously, she must have been impregnated by a stray before she ran off. That's unlikely, Jim countered. Your paperwork states she was kept in a secure facility. How would a stray dog gain access? Emily watched Steve's face carefully, noting the flash of annoyance that crossed his features before his smooth mask returned. These things happen, Mr. Peterson. The important thing is that we found her, and I'm prepared to compensate you for your trouble. He pulled a checkbook from his pocket. Shall we say $500? That seems more than fair for temporary boarding. Martha, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. What about the puppies? They're still nursing. Steve barely glanced at the 3 puppies huddled together in their bed of blankets. They're not purebred or trained. They have no value to the company. You can keep them or give them away, whatever you prefer. Emily gasped. You can't separate them. They still need their mother. Emily, Jim cautioned gently, though his own face had hardened at Steve's callous attitude. Sheriff Daniels cleared his throat awkwardly. Perhaps we should wait for Doc Williams before making any decisions. If this is your dog, Mr. Miller, we want to ensure a proper handover. The next hour passed in tense silence. Emily sat beside Faith, whispering reassurances the dog seemed to understand, while Steve paced impatiently outside the barn. Jim used the time to make a quiet phone call from the house, returning with a determined set to his jaw that gave Emily a flicker of hope. Dr. Williams arrived in his battered station wagon, medical bag in hand. The elderly veterinarian greeted Jim warmly before turning a considerably cooler gaze on Steve Miller. I understand there's a dispute over ownership, he said, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. Sheriff Daniels nodded. Mr. Miller has documentation for a dog matching this one's description. We need to verify the microchip and assess the animal's condition. Dr. Williams knelt beside Faith, who accepted his examination with surprising calmness. The vet checked her thoroughly, paying particular attention to the healing wounds on her leg and side. These injuries, he said finally, looking up at Sheriff Daniels, they're not consistent with being caught in a fence alone. There are older scars beneath the recent wounds, evidence of repeated injuries and poor nutrition over time. Steve shifted uncomfortably. She was in a training program. Working dogs sometimes get injured. Dr. Williams' expression hardened. I've treated military and police dogs for 40 years, young man. These aren't training injuries. This dog has been systematically mistreated. He pulled a small handheld device from his bag. Now, let's check that microchip. The scanner beeped as he passed it over Faith's shoulder. Dr. Williams studied the readout, then frowned. The chip number is 785431, not 457892 as listed in your documentation, Mr. Miller. Steve's face flushed. That's impossible. There must be a mistake. No mistake, said a new voice from the barn entrance. Everyone turned to see an older man in a military uniform standing in the doorway. That dog is not Bella. Her name is Sergeant Faith, and she belongs to the United States Army. The newcomer stepped into the barn, his bearing unmistakably military despite his age. Faith's reaction was immediate and stunning. Her entire demeanor changed, ears perking forward, tail wagging with recognition. Colonel Harrison, Jim said, stepping forward to shake the man's hand. Thank you for coming so quickly. Colonel Harrison nodded grimly. When you mentioned the chip number, I knew immediately. Sergeant Faith disappeared from Fort Hood 3 months ago during a training exercise. We suspected theft but couldn't prove it. He turned a steely gaze on Steve Miller. Until now. Steve's confident facade crumbled. I don't know what you're talking about. My company purchased Bella legally. Save it for the investigation, Colonel Harrison interrupted. Miller Pharmaceuticals has been on our radar for months. allegations of acquiring military working dogs for unauthorized testing. He turned to Sheriff Daniels. "I've already contacted the FBI. They'll want to question Mr. Miller about how a decorated military working dog ended up in his possession." Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. Faith, her Faith, was a military hero? She looked at the German shepherd with new eyes, seeing beyond the gentle mother to the trained protector beneath. Sheriff Daniels, looking increasingly uncomfortable, moved toward Steve. "Mr. Miller, I think you'd better come with me until we sort this out." Steve's face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. I have papers." "Forged papers," Colonel Harrison cut in. "The real Bella died 6 months ago in your company's testing facility. We have a whistleblower who's provided extensive documentation." The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Steve lunged suddenly toward the barn door, attempting to flee, but Faith moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. Despite her still healing injuries, she launched herself between Steve and the exit, her teeth bared in a warning snarl that stopped him in his tracks. "Down, Sergeant," Colonel Harrison commanded gently. Faith immediately dropped to a protective stance, still blocking the exit but no longer actively threatening. Sheriff Daniels recovered from his surprise and stepped forward, handcuffs ready. "Mr. Miller, you're under arrest for fraud to start with. I expect there'll be more charges once the FBI gets here." As the sheriff led a subdued Steve to the police cruiser, Colonel Harrison turned to Jim and Emily. "Sergeant Faith was one of our best. Served 2 tours in Afghanistan detecting explosives, saved countless lives. When she disappeared, we feared the worst." Emily knelt beside Faith, who returned to her puppies now that the threat was removed. "She found us," she said simply, "when she needed help the most." Colonel Harrison smiled, the stern military demeanor softening. "She's always had good judgment about people." He hesitated. "Normally she would be returned to service or retired to a handler's family, but with the puppies and her injuries." Jim stepped forward. "Colonel, my granddaughter has nursed Faith back to health. They've formed a bond that would be cruel to break." "And this farm needs a good dog," Martha added, her practical tone belied by the moisture in her eyes. Colonel Harrison surveyed the scene. Faith surrounded by her puppies, Emily's protective hand on the dog's back, the obvious care that had gone into the comfortable barn arrangement. "I believe I could make a case for an honorable discharge and civilian adoption," he said finally. "Especially to a fellow veteran." Emily's heart soared with hope. "You mean Faith can stay with us?" "Sergeant Faith has certainly earned her retirement," Colonel Harrison confirmed with a smile. "Though there will be paperwork and likely a ceremony. The Army doesn't let its heroes go without proper recognition." As if understanding the conversation, Faith rested her head against Emily's side, her intelligent eyes moving between the humans who were deciding her fate. In that moment, with the sunlight streaming through the barn door, illuminating them all in a golden glow, Emily felt a certainty that transcended her 10 years. This was meant to be, a convergence of paths that had seemed random but were perhaps guided by something greater than chance. Outside, the police cruiser departed with Steve Miller in the back seat, his pharmaceutical empire about to crumble under federal investigation. Inside the barn, surrounded by new life and renewed purpose, the future suddenly seemed less frightening, more full of promise than anyone on the Peterson farm had dared to hope for in a very long time. The small victories of the day, Steve Miller's arrest, Colonel Harrison's provisional approval for Faith to remain with the Petersons, had cast a golden glow over the farm that lingered into evening. Emily sat on the porch swing beside her grandfather, a contentment she hadn't felt since before her mother's illness warming her chest. Faith lay at their feet, her puppies finally asleep in the barn after an exhausting day of exploration and excitement. "Will Faith really get to stay with us forever, Grandpa?" Emily asked, still half afraid their good fortune might evaporate like morning dew under the harsh Texas sun. Jim nodded, his weathered face relaxed in the soft twilight. Colonel Harrison is a man of his word. He'll handle the paperwork to officially retire Faith from service. And the bank? Emily's voice dropped to a whisper, asking the question that had hovered unspoken throughout the day's drama. Jim's smile faded. That's a different battle, sweetheart. But we'll keep fighting. From inside the house came the sound of the telephone ringing. Martha's voice drifted through the screen door as she answered, followed by an uncharacteristic exclamation of surprise. Moments later, she appeared at the door, her expression troubled. "It's your father," she told Emily. "He wants to speak with you." Emily's stomach clenched. She hadn't spoken to her father in nearly 2 weeks, their last conversation stilted and awkward as always. Robert Carson tried, she knew that, but since her mother's death it was as if he looked at Emily and saw only his pain reflected back at him. Taking the receiver, Emily twisted the coiled phone cord around her finger. "Hi, Dad." "Emily." Her father's voice sounded strange, tight and controlled. "How are you, sweetheart?" "I'm good," she replied, wondering why he was calling so late. "We rescued a dog, Dad." "Her name is Faith, and she has 3 puppies, and she's actually a military hero." "Emily," he interrupted, "I'm coming to get you tomorrow." The words fell like stones, heavy and cold. "What?" "But I'm supposed to stay until the end of August. School doesn't start for 3 more weeks. There's been a change of plans." Robert's voice softened slightly at her distress. "I've accepted a new position in Dallas. We need to move before the school year begins, and I need you home to help pack." "But Dad," Emily's voice cracked as panic rose in her throat. "I can't leave now. Faith needs me. And Grandma and Grandpa." "Emily, this isn't a discussion. I've already made the arrangements. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon to pick you up." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she handed the receiver to her grandmother. Martha's face darkened as she listened to whatever Robert was saying, her free hand finding Emily's shoulder in silent support. "Robert, this is very sudden," Martha said, her tone carefully measured. "Emily has responsibilities here. She's caring for an injured dog and her puppies." Emily couldn't hear her father's response, but Martha's expression told her everything she needed to know. The decision had been made. Adults always decided things without considering how children might feel, a lesson Emily had learned painfully when her mother died and her whole world changed without her consent. "Very well," Martha said finally. "We'll have her ready." She hung up the phone and turned to Emily, compassion softening her practical nature. "Oh, child." Emily fled to the barn, tears streaming down her face. Faith raised her head alertly as Emily burst through the door, immediately sensing her distress. The German shepherd rose from her bed, wincing slightly as she put weight on her healing leg, and moved to Emily's side as the girl collapsed onto a hay bale. "I can't leave you," Emily sobbed, burying her face in Faith's thick fur. "I promised I wouldn't." Faith pressed against her, a solid, warm presence offering comfort without words. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, her amber eyes seemed to hold understanding beyond human comprehension. Jim appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the night sky. "Emily?" "It's not fair," she choked out. "Everything good gets taken away." Her grandfather settled beside her on the hay bale, his arm around her trembling shoulders. "Your father needs you, sweetheart, just like Faith needed you." "But Faith still needs me," Emily protested. "And I need her." "I know," Jim sighed heavily. "Life has a way of testing us just when we think we've found our footing." They sat in silence for a long moment, Faith's steady presence anchoring them both. Outside, a night bird called, a lonely sound that echoed Emily's aching heart. "What if—" Emily began hesitantly, an idea forming through her tears. "What if Faith and the puppies came with me to Dallas?" Jim's expression was gentle but regretful. "Your father's apartment probably doesn't allow pets, Emily, especially large dogs with puppies." "But she's special," Emily insisted. "She's a hero. Dad would understand if he just met her." Jim didn't contradict her, but his silence spoke volumes. Robert Carson, still raw from his wife's death, barely managing his own grief while raising a daughter alone, was unlikely to welcome the added responsibility of a dog, let alone 4. "We'll take good care of Faith and her puppies," Jim promised. "You can call every day to check on them, and visit whenever your father brings you." The reassurance rang hollow. Dallas was 4 hours away. With her father's demanding new job and their complicated relationship with her grandparents, Emily knew visits would be rare and brief. "It's all going to change again," she whispered, a statement rather than a question. Jim had no answer for that undeniable truth. Emily slept in the barn that night, curled against Faith's warm side with the puppies nestled between them. Martha brought blankets and a pillow without protest, understanding her granddaughter's need for these precious final hours with the dog who had somehow begun healing the wound left by Caroline's death. Morning came too quickly, the golden Texas sunrise that had once seemed so full of promise now marking the beginning of the end. Emily moved through her chores mechanically, feeding Faith and the puppies, refreshing their water, checking Faith's healing wounds one last time. Each task felt like saying goodbye. Martha had laid out Emily's best dress, the blue one with white collar that her mother had bought the Christmas before she got sick. Emily stared at it blankly. "I don't want to dress up for him," she said, the childish defiance masking deeper pain. Martha sighed. "It's not for him, child. It's because this is an important day, and important days deserve proper clothes." Emily dressed reluctantly, the familiar fabric now slightly too small across her shoulders. She'd grown this summer, in more ways than one. By noon, her small suitcase sat packed by the door. The few possessions she'd brought to the farm seemed inadequate containers for the memories she'd made. How could she pack the feeling of Faith's puppies squirming in her lap, or the pride when Faith first trusted her enough to take food from her hand? "Your father just turned onto the main road," Jim announced, returning from checking the mailbox. "He'll be here in about 10 minutes. Emily nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She knelt beside Faith, who sensed the impending separation with uncanny awareness. The German shepherd pressed her head against Emily's chest as if trying to imprint her heartbeat on her memory. "I'll come back," Emily whispered fiercely. "I promise, and I'll write letters and call and—" Her voice broke. Hope, the smallest puppy, crawled into her lap, looking up with trusting eyes that only intensified Emily's pain. Love and courage soon followed, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to be close to the human who had helped save them. The sound of a car engine approaching shattered the moment. Faith's ears pricked forward, her body tensing slightly as she positioned herself protectively in front of Emily and the puppies. "It's okay, Faith," Emily soothed, though her own heart raced with anxiety. "It's just my dad." Through the barn door, she watched her father's sedan pull up to the farmhouse. Robert Carson stepped out, tall and thin in his city clothes that looked out of place against the weathered farm buildings. His face was drawn, with new lines Emily didn't remember from just 2 months ago. "Emily?" he called, spotting her in the barn doorway. She stepped out reluctantly, Faith at her side. "Hi, Dad." Robert froze at the sight of the large German shepherd. "Emily, get away from that dog," he ordered sharply. "It's okay, Dad. This is Faith. She's the dog I told you about on the phone." "I don't care what her name is. Those animals can be dangerous." Robert's fear of dogs had intensified after an incident when Emily was small. A neighbor's German shepherd had bitten Caroline when she tried to break up a fight with another dog. "Faith isn't dangerous," Emily protested. "She's a hero. She was an army dog in Afghanistan." Jim appeared from the house, extending his hand to his son-in-law. "Robert, good to see you." The greeting was cordial but cool. The two men had never been close, their relationship further strained after Caroline's death when Robert had rejected Jim and Martha's offer to help raise Emily. "Jim," Robert nodded stiffly, "I appreciate you keeping Emily for the summer, but we need to get on the road. We have a long drive ahead." Martha emerged from the house carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I've packed some sandwiches and cookies for the trip," she said, her practical nature asserting itself in this small act of grandmotherly care. "Thank you, Martha, but that wasn't necessary. We'll stop for lunch on the way." Robert's dismissal was polite but firm. Emily felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded an asthma attack. The thought of leaving Faith, leaving the farm, returning to the suffocating silence of life with her grieving father, it was too much. "Dad," she began, her voice small but determined. "Faith needs me. Can't she come with us?" "Please?" Robert's expression hardened. "Emily, we've discussed this. Our apartment doesn't allow pets." "But she's special. She's not just any pet. And she was Mom's favorite kind of dog." "Stop!" Robert's voice cracked like a whip. "I don't want to hear about your mother right now." The words hung in the air, sharp and painful. Martha gasped softly, and Jim's weathered face darkened. "Robert," he began, a warning in his tone, but the damage was done. Emily felt something inside her shatter, the fragile hope that her father might someday heal enough to speak of Caroline without pain, that they might someday be a real family again instead of two wounded souls circling each other in wary silence. The tightness in her chest intensified, her breathing becoming labored. Faith, attuned to Emily's distress, pressed against her leg supportively. "Get away from my daughter," Robert snapped at the dog, moving forward. Faith didn't growl, but her posture shifted subtly, placing herself more firmly between Emily and the perceived threat. Robert halted, his fear of dogs warring with his concern for his daughter. "Emily," he said, his voice strained, "get your suitcase. It's time to go." Emily couldn't speak, couldn't move. The world narrowed to a tunnel of pain as her airways constricted. She fumbled in her pocket for her inhaler, fingers clumsy with panic. "Emily?" Jim's voice seemed to come from far away. "Emily, what's wrong?" Faith barked once, sharply, drawing attention to Emily's distress as the girl sank to her knees, the inhaler slipping from her grasp. "She's having an attack!" Martha cried, rushing forward. Robert stood frozen, his face a mask of helpless terror. He'd seen these attacks before, had watched Caroline talk Emily through them countless times, but without Caroline, he always felt paralyzed, unsure how to help his own daughter. Jim reached Emily first, retrieving the fallen inhaler and placing it in her hands. "Easy, sweetheart. Small breaths. You know the drill." Faith whined anxiously, nudging Emily's arm with her nose. The puppies, sensing the tension, had followed their mother from the barn and now circled Emily with confused concern. As Emily struggled to use the inhaler, her vision darkening at the edges, Faith did something remarkable. She placed her paw gently on Emily's chest, then removed it, repeating the action in a steady rhythm. "She's showing her how to breathe," Jim said wonderingly. "I've heard of service dogs trained to help with panic attacks, but this—" Emily focused on Faith's steady gesture, trying to match her breathing to the rhythm. Gradually, the medicine began to work, the terrible tightness easing enough for her to draw shaky breaths. "That's it," Jim encouraged. "You're doing great, Emily." Robert finally broke from his paralysis, kneeling beside his daughter. "Emily, Can you hear me?" She nodded weakly, still focused on Faith's calming presence. "I'm sorry," Robert whispered, his composure cracking to reveal the scared, grieving man beneath. "I shouldn't have. Your mother—" He stopped, unable to continue. Martha placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Robert, I think Emily needs to rest before traveling. Her attacks can leave her exhausted." For once, Robert didn't argue. He lifted Emily gently, cradling her as if she were much younger than 10, and carried her toward the house. Faith followed anxiously until Jim gave a subtle hand signal for her to stay. Inside, Robert laid Emily on the sofa while Martha fetched a glass of water and a cool cloth for her forehead. The familiar routine from Caroline's final months, caring for someone struggling to breathe, hung unspoken in the air between them. "I didn't know her attacks were still this bad," Robert said quietly. "They haven't been," Jim replied. "This is the first one all summer." The implication wasn't lost on Robert. His daughter had thrived here at the farm, away from the silent apartment filled with ghosts and unspoken grief. Away from him. Emily's breathing had steadied, though her face remained pale. "I'm okay now," she whispered. "Can Faith come inside? Please?" Robert hesitated, his ingrained fear of dogs warring with the undeniable evidence of Faith's positive effect on his daughter. "That dog just helped Emily through an asthma attack better than any of us," Martha pointed out practically. "When medicine and people weren't enough." After a long moment, Robert nodded. Jim opened the screen door and Faith entered cautiously, her nails clicking on the hardwood floor as she approached Emily. With remarkable gentleness, she settled beside the sofa, resting her head where Emily could easily touch her. The simple comfort of the dog's presence seemed to ease something in Emily that medicine alone couldn't reach. Within minutes, she had drifted into an exhausted sleep, one hand resting on Faith's head. Robert watched them, something shifting behind his tired eyes. "I didn't know dogs could do that," he said finally. "Faith isn't just any dog," Jim replied quietly. "She's been through hell and back, but she still trusts, still protects, still loves." He glanced meaningfully at his son-in-law. "Reminds me of someone else I know." The parallel hung in the air between them. Robert and Faith, both wounded, both fiercely protective of those they loved, both struggling to trust again after profound loss. Martha brought coffee, her practical nature finding comfort in the routine of hospitality, even in crisis. "Emily can't leave today," she stated firmly. "Not after an attack like that." For once, Robert didn't argue. He accepted the coffee with murmured thanks, his gaze never leaving his sleeping daughter and the dog who had possibly saved her from a trip to the emergency room. The afternoon sun slanted through the farmhouse windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the golden beams. Outside, the puppies played in the yard under Jim's watchful eye. Inside, a fragile truce settled over the adults as they maintained their silent vigil over Emily's sleep. None of them knew yet how this day would end, whether Emily would leave tomorrow or stay, whether Faith would remain at the farm or find a new home in Dallas, whether the wounds of the past could begin to heal in the presence of new love. But for now, in the quiet aftermath of crisis, there was a moment of peace, of possibility. And sometimes, in the face of life's deepest tragedies, a moment is enough to begin rebuilding what seemed forever lost. Emily woke to the gentle sound of voices from the kitchen, her father's deeper tones mingling with her grandfather's weathered drawl in conversation rather than argument. Faith remained beside the sofa, amber eyes alert and watchful, her tail thumping gently against the hardwood floor when she noticed Emily was awake. "Hey, girl," Emily whispered, her voice still raspy from the asthma attack. She reached out to stroke Faith's silky ear, drawing comfort from the warm solidity of the dog's presence. The kitchen voices paused, and Robert appeared in the doorway, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. His face looked different somehow. The tight lines of perpetual grief momentarily softened into something resembling the father Emily remembered from before her mother's illness. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" he asked, approaching cautiously, his gaze flickering between Emily and Faith. "Better," Emily replied, pushing herself to a sitting position. The room stayed steady, her breathing clear, the aftermath of this attack less severe than usual. Robert settled in the armchair across from the sofa, his posture rigid with the discomfort of a man unused to meaningful conversations. "Your grandfather has been telling me about Faith," he said finally, "about how you found her and what you've done to help her heal." Emily nodded, uncertain where this was leading but wary of hope after so many disappointments. "He also told me about the situation with the farm," Robert continued, surprising Emily. Financial troubles were among the many subjects adults discussed behind closed doors, pretending children couldn't understand the weight of unpaid bills or foreclosure notices. "Are Grandma and Grandpa going to lose the farm?" Emily asked directly, tired of being protected from truths that affected her life. Robert glanced toward the kitchen where Jim and Martha remained, deliberately giving father and daughter privacy for this conversation. "It's possible," he admitted, "but your grandfather is exploring options." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by Faith's steady breathing and the distant sound of the puppies playing in the yard. Emily waited, sensing her father had more to say, but was struggling to find the words. "Emily," he began finally, setting his coffee mug on the side table with deliberate care, "I haven't been fair to you since your mother died." The simple acknowledgement, spoken aloud after 2 years of pretending everything was fine, struck Emily like a physical blow. Her eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously, determined to have this conversation as equals rather than as a child to be comforted. "I know you miss her too, Dad," she said, the words barely audible. Robert's composure cracked, his hands clenching on the armrests. "Every day," he admitted, "but I should have remembered that you lost her too. Instead He trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the space between them, the emotional distance that had grown alongside their shared grief. Faith sensed Emily's distress, pressing closer against the sofa, her warm weight a steady anchor. Robert noticed the dog's protective posture, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "She takes care of you," he observed quietly. "We take care of each other," Emily corrected. "That's what family does." The simple truth hung in the air between them, an indictment of what their own small family had failed to do since Caroline's death. Robert nodded slowly, as if coming to a decision. "The job in Dallas," he said carefully. "It's not finalized yet. I can still turn it down if—" He paused, gathering courage. "If we decide to stay in Houston." Emily's heart leaped, though she tried to contain her hope. "Really? It's a better position, more money," Robert admitted. "But money isn't everything. Your happiness matters more." Before Emily could respond, a sharp knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron as she went to answer it. Sheriff Daniels stood on the porch, his expression grave beneath his uniform hat. "Morning, Martha. Jim around? Got some news I think he'll want to hear." Jim appeared behind Martha, tension evident in his stance. "What's happened, Sheriff?" "FBI raided Miller Pharmaceuticals this morning," Sheriff Daniels announced, stepping inside when Martha gestured him in. "Found evidence of illegal animal testing, falsified records, the works. Steve Miller's looking at federal charges now, not just local ones." Faith's ears pricked forward at the mention of Miller's name, her body tensing slightly. Emily placed a reassuring hand on the dog's shoulder. "There's more," Sheriff Daniels continued, nodding a greeting to Robert and Emily. "They found other dogs, military and service animals reported missing over the past year, some in pretty bad shape." Emily gasped. Will they be okay? The sheriff's expression softened at her concern. They're getting proper veterinary care now, thanks to Colonel Harrison. Speaking of which, he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out an official-looking envelope. The colonel asked me to deliver this personally. Jim accepted the envelope, his weathered hands carefully breaking the seal. As he read the contents, his expression transformed from concern to disbelief, and finally to something Emily hadn't seen on her grandfather's face in years. Hope. What is it, Jim? Martha asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Jim cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. It's from the Department of Defense. Regarding Sergeant Faith. He looked up, meeting Emily's eager gaze. They're officially retiring her from service with full honors. And... He paused, scanning further down the page. There's a commendation bonus for her years of service and for the recovery of evidence leading to Miller's arrest. $20,000. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. 20,000? To be paid to her adopted family, Jim confirmed, his eyes meeting Robert's in silent communication. Sheriff Daniels smiled, clearly pleased to be the bearer of good news for once. Colonel Harrison pulled some strings, said something about the Army taking care of its own, and that includes their four-legged veterans. Emily slid from the sofa to kneel beside Faith, wrapping her arms around the dog's neck. Did you hear that, Faith? You're officially retired. You can stay with us forever. Faith's tail thumped against the floor, her warm tongue gently licking Emily's cheek as if in understanding. There's more, Jim said, continuing to read. The Army wants to hold a formal retirement ceremony next month at Fort Hood. Full military honors for a decorated veteran who saved countless lives during her service. Sheriff Daniels nodded approvingly. She deserves it. Those military working dogs are heroes most folks never hear about. As the adults continued discussing the implications of the letter, Emily remained on the floor with Faith, whispering private congratulations to the dog who had changed everything. Faith responded with the steady, calming presence that had become Emily's anchor through the tumultuous summer. A shadow fell across them as Robert approached, kneeling awkwardly to meet Faith at eye level. The German shepherd regarded him cautiously, neither retreating nor advancing. "Thank you," Robert said quietly to the dog, "for helping my daughter when I couldn't." Faith tilted her head slightly, studying this unfamiliar human with intelligent eyes. After a moment of consideration, she extended her muzzle and gently licked Robert's hand, a gesture of acceptance that brought unexpected tears to his eyes. Emily watched in amazement as her father, who had flinched at the sight of dogs since the incident years ago, tentatively reached out to stroke Faith's head. The simple action seemed to bridge more than just his fear of dogs. It was a step toward healing deeper wounds. Jim watched the interaction with thoughtful eyes before turning back to Sheriff Daniels. "Any word on what happens to Miller Pharmaceuticals now?" he asked. The sheriff settled his hat more comfortably on his head. "Company's finished. Assets frozen pending investigation. Their property will likely be auctioned off once the case is closed." He hesitated, then added, "Includes that tract of land adjoining yours to the east. The one with the year-round creek." Jim's expression remained carefully neutral, though Emily noticed the way his shoulders straightened slightly. That particular piece of land had been coveted by Peterson farmers for generations. The reliable water source would make their drought-vulnerable farm significantly more viable. "Interesting," was all Jim said. But Emily recognized the calculating look in his eyes, the same expression he'd worn when repairing the tractor engine everyone else had declared hopeless. As Sheriff Daniels took his leave, the farmhouse settled into a strange new atmosphere. Tension remained, but it was the tension of possibility rather than conflict. Emily felt it vibrating in the air, like the distant rumble of thunderstorms that brought life-giving rain to parched earth. Robert rose stiffly from his crouch beside Faith, his face set in lines of determination. "Jim, Martha," he said formally, "I'd like to discuss something with you." "Regarding the farm?" Martha exchanged a quick glance with Jim before nodding. "Of course, Robert. Let's sit in the kitchen." Emily made to follow, but Robert shook his head. "This is adult business, Emily. Why don't you take Faith outside to check on her puppies?" The familiar dismissal stung, though Emily recognized it came from habit rather than intentional exclusion. She was gathering courage to protest when Jim unexpectedly intervened. "I think Emily has earned a seat at the table," he said quietly. "She's proven herself more than capable this summer." Robert looked startled, then thoughtful. After a moment he nodded. "You're right. Emily, if you want to join us, you're welcome." The simple acknowledgement of her maturity felt like a victory more significant than anything Emily had experienced in the 2 years since her mother's death. She followed the adults to the kitchen table, Faith padding softly behind her. Martha brought fresh coffee for the adults and lemonade for Emily, the familiar ritual of hospitality providing structure to this unprecedented family summit. Through the window, Emily could see the puppies dozing in a patch of shade, their morning play session having exhausted their boundless energy. Robert took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly around his coffee mug. "I've been thinking about Caroline," he began, his voice steady despite the pain the name still evoked. "About what she wanted for our family." Martha and Jim remained silent, giving their son-in-law the space to continue at his own pace. "She loved this farm," Robert continued. "Even after we moved to Houston, she always talked about bringing Emily here for summers, about keeping the connection to the land and the family history." He looked directly at Jim. "I failed to honor that after she died. I was too wrapped up in my own grief." Jim shook his head. "We all cope with loss in our own ways, Robert." "Maybe," Robert acknowledged, "but I could have done better by Emily." He turned to his daughter. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. For shutting down, for pushing away your grandparents, for not talking about your mother when I know you needed to." Emily swallowed hard against the lump in her throat. "It's okay, Dad. I understand." "It's not okay," Robert insisted gently. "But I want to make it right." He straightened in his chair, addressing Jim and Martha directly. "I'd like to propose a partnership. The farm needs capital investment to remain viable, and Emily needs the stability of family and a place to call home." Jim's expression remained careful, though a spark of interest flashed in his eyes. "What kind of partnership?" "I have savings," Robert explained. "Money I've been setting aside for years, originally for a larger house, then for Caroline's treatments, then—" He trailed off. "It's just been sitting in an account, serving no purpose, enough to pay off the farm's mortgage and make necessary improvements." Martha gasped softly. "Robert, that's a considerable offer." "It comes with conditions," Robert continued. "First, I want Emily to be able to spend significant time here, school breaks, summers, weekends when possible. Second, I want Faith and her puppies to have a permanent home here on the farm." Emily could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her father, practical, emotionally reserved Robert Carson, was offering to save the Peterson farm and ensure Faith could stay. "And third," Robert added, his voice softening as he looked at his daughter, "I want us all to be a family again, the way Caroline would have wanted." The silence that followed felt sacred somehow, as if Caroline's presence filled the farmhouse kitchen, witnessing this moment of reconciliation she had not lived to see. Jim was the first to respond, his weathered hand reaching across the table to grasp Robert's. "Son," he said simply, the word carrying years of unspoken forgiveness and hope. Faith, who had been lying quietly beside Emily's chair, suddenly raised her head alertly. Her ears pricked forward, body tensing in a posture Emily had come to recognize as warning rather than threat. "What is it, girl?" Jim asked. instantly attentive to the dog's change in behavior. A moment later, they all heard it. The distant but distinctive sound of a vehicle approaching fast down the long farm driveway, tires kicking up gravel in a way that suggested urgency rather than caution. Martha moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain to look out. "It's Tommy," she reported, recognizing the beat-up truck belonging to their neighbors, the Millers. "Driving like the devil himself is after him." Jim rose from the table, moving to the door with the instinctive wariness of a man who had seen combat. Faith followed, positioning herself protectively in front of the family as the truck skidded to a halt in the yard. Tommy leaped from the driver's seat, his freckled face flushed with excitement or fear, perhaps both. "Mr. Peterson," he called, running toward the house. "Fire! There's a fire heading this way from the eastern property line." Jim's face paled beneath his weathered tan. "Where, exactly?" "Started on the old Miller Pharmaceuticals testing facility," Tommy panted. "Dad says it looks deliberate. Sheriff's already called for backup from the county, but with this drought and the wind picking up—" He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood the implications. Summer wildfires could consume thousands of acres of Texas farmland in hours, destroying everything in their path. "Martha, call the volunteer fire department," Jim ordered, already moving toward the barn where the farm's meager firefighting equipment was stored. "Robert, help me get the tractor and plow." "We need to cut a fire break before it reaches the eastern fields." Emily stood frozen for a moment, the peaceful family discussion of moments ago shattered by this new crisis. Faith pressed against her legs, a warm reminder of duty and courage in the face of danger. "What about Faith and the puppies?" Emily asked, fear making her voice high and thin. "They can't outrun a fire." Robert paused in the doorway, his gaze moving from his daughter to the dog at her side. In his eyes, Emily saw a moment of calculation, not coldness, but the necessary assessment of priorities in an emergency. "We'll load them in my car," he decided quickly. "Get them to safety first, then come back to help Jim." The simple inclusion of the dogs in the evacuation plan told Emily more about her father's transformation than any words could have. Robert Carson, who had once been willing to separate Emily from the animals she loved, now considered Faith and her puppy's family to be protected. As they moved into action, Emily felt a strange sense of clarity cutting through her fear. This was what Faith had been trained for: crisis, danger, the moments when lives hung in the balance. And somehow, through loving the wounded warrior dog, Emily had absorbed some of that same steady courage. The summer that had begun with a desperate rescue beside a barbed wire fence was building toward its climax in fire and smoke. But they would face it together, a family reunited, strengthened by shared purpose and unexpected love. And sometimes, Emily realized as she gathered the whimpering puppies into a blanket, the greatest revelations came in the moments when everything seemed about to be lost. 1 year later, the Peterson family farm looked remarkably different. The scorched earth from last summer's fire had given way to new growth, the blackened fields now vibrant with crops planted in soil enriched by the ashes of what came before. The farmhouse sported a fresh coat of white paint, its sagging porch rebuilt and adorned with hanging baskets of petunias that swayed gently in the Texas breeze. Emily Carson sat on the porch swing, her legs dangling as she watched Faith patrolling the perimeter of the yard with military precision. At 11, Emily had grown several inches over the past year, her chestnut hair now falling past her shoulders in the same waves her mother's had once had. Beside her, Hope, no longer the runt but still the smallest of Faith's puppies, dozed contentedly, her head resting on Emily's lap. "They're here," Martha called from inside the house, having spotted the familiar sedan turning onto the long driveway. Emily's heart leaped with excitement. Though she now spent every weekend and school holiday at the farm, her father's visits were less frequent, his work in Houston keeping him busy during the week. Today was special, though, the anniversary of finding Faith, a day the family had decided to commemorate each year as their own private holiday. Faith's ears perked up at the sound of the approaching car, her tail beginning to wag as she recognized Robert's vehicle. The transformation in the German Shepherd's response to Emily's father had been as remarkable as Robert's own evolution over the past year. What had begun as cautious tolerance had developed into genuine affection, with Faith now greeting Robert with the same enthusiasm she showed the rest of the family. The car pulled up in front of the farmhouse and Robert emerged looking more relaxed than Emily had seen him in years. The haunted shadows that had lingered in his eyes since Caroline's death hadn't disappeared completely. Grief never truly vanished, as Grandpa Jim often said, but they had softened into something that could coexist with joy. "There's my girl," Robert called, opening his arms as Emily flew down the porch steps to embrace him. Faith circled them excitedly, her training still evident in the way she maintained a respectful distance until Robert knelt to greet her properly. "And there's my other girl," he said, scratching behind her ears in the spot Emily had shown him she preferred. Jim emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. The past year had been kind to him as well. The weight of impending financial disaster lifted from his shoulders. He stood straighter, moved more easily, smiled more readily. "Good drive?" he asked Robert, the two men clasping hands with the comfortable familiarity that had replaced their former tension. "Not bad," Robert replied. "Traffic was light, and I made good time." He glanced toward the renovated barn with its fresh red paint. "How's the new addition settling in?" Jim's face broke into an unabashed grin. "Come see for yourself." Emily took her father's hand, tugging him toward the barn with Faith trotting alongside them. Inside, the cool dimness gave way to a purpose-built space that occupied what had once been unused storage. A simple sign reading Peterson Farm Veterinary Clinic hung above a neat reception desk where Martha now sat, updating records on the computer Robert had insisted on providing. "We've had 3 new clients this week alone," Martha reported proudly. Words spreading about Jim's special touch with the difficult cases. Jim shrugged modestly, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. The small veterinary practice he'd established after the fire had grown steadily, filling a need in the rural community while providing the Petersons with a stable income independent of the farm's sometimes unpredictable harvests. "And how are our other special residents?" Robert asked, following Emily toward the back of the barn where spacious kennels housed several dogs in various stages of rehabilitation. "Courage brought Duke out of his shell," Emily reported, gesturing toward where her favorite of Faith's puppies, now a handsome, full-grown German Shepherd, was lying patiently beside a trembling Labrador. "He wouldn't let anyone touch him when he first came, but Courage showed him it was safe." The decision to use the farm as a rehabilitation center for rescued military and service dogs had evolved naturally after the publicity surrounding Faith's story. Colonel Harrison had reached out after several more dogs were recovered from situations similar to Faith's, needing a place where they could heal both physically and psychologically before being rehomed or, in some cases, returned to service. "Love comes home tomorrow," Jim added, referring to the second of Faith's puppies, who had been adopted by a local veterans organization as a therapy dog. "His handler says he's the best they've ever had, especially with the younger vet suffering from PTSD. Robert nodded approvingly. "And how's our college girl doing?" he asked, referring to the third puppy who had been selected for specialized search and rescue training at a facility in Oklahoma. "Top of her class," Emily said proudly. "They say she has her mother's instincts." As if aware she was being discussed, Faith moved to Emily's side, her graying muzzle and slight limp the only visible signs of her age and past traumas. The retired military working dog had found her true calling as the matriarch of the Peterson Farms Canine Rehabilitation Program, her steady presence providing a model for the traumatized dogs who arrived, frightened and aggressive, but gradually learned to trust again. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Robert said quietly, surveying the thriving operation that had risen from the ashes of last summer's fire. The wildfire that had threatened to destroy everything had, ironically, become their salvation. Started deliberately by one of Steve Miller's associates attempting to destroy evidence, the blaze had been contained before it could reach the Peterson farmhouse, thanks to the combined efforts of Jim, Robert, and the volunteer fire department. The firebreak they'd hastily plowed had held just long enough for reinforcements to arrive. In the aftermath, as the community rallied to help the Petersons and other affected farms recover, an unexpected blessing had emerged. The Miller Pharmaceuticals property, badly damaged in the fire, had been auctioned at a fraction of its value as part of the federal case against the company. With Robert's investment and a small business loan, the Petersons had acquired the adjacent land with its valuable year-round creek, doubling the size of their farm and securing its water supply for generations to come. "Sometimes the worst days become turning points," Jim observed, echoing Emily's thoughts. "If you survive them." Robert's hand found Emily's shoulder, squeezing gently. "Caroline would have loved this," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "All of it, the farm, the dogs, seeing us become a family again." Once, such a direct reference to her mother would have plunged them all into awkward silence. Now it felt like an honest acknowledgement of the woman whose love continued to shape their lives even in her absence. "She does love it," Emily said softly. "I think she sees it all." Martha appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Dinner's ready, and if you all don't come now, it'll be cold by the time you finish talking about those dogs." The familiar complaint, delivered with obvious affection, made them all smile. Some things hadn't changed. Martha's practical nature, her insistence on punctuality for meals, her pretense that the dogs were merely tolerated rather than beloved. But like everything else on the Peterson farm, even Martha's predictable fussing had acquired a new warmth, a sense of gratitude for the ordinary rhythms of family life that had nearly been lost. As they walked back to the house, Faith falling into step beside Emily, with the easy synchronicity of long companionship, the setting sun cast golden light across the flourishing fields. In the distance, the newly built training area where Courage worked with the rehabilitation dogs stood as a testament to purpose found through adversity. The kitchen table was set with the good dishes, Caroline's china that Martha had carefully preserved and now brought out for special occasions. A vase of wildflowers gathered from the meadow added a touch of casual beauty, and the aroma of Martha's famous pot roast filled the house with the promise of comfort and satisfaction. "Before we eat," Jim said as they settled around the table, "I think we should take a moment to remember how this all began." He reached for Martha's hand, and she for Robert's, creating a circle that included Emily and, by extension, Faith, who sat attentively at her side. "1 year ago," Jim continued, his voice deepening with emotion, "a wounded shepherd found her way to a little girl with a wounded heart. Neither one should have survived what they'd been through, but together they found the strength to heal." Emily felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the fullness of gratitude that sometimes overwhelmed her when she contemplated how completely her life had transformed. From the lonely asthmatic child living in silent grief with her father, she had become part of something larger, a family united by love and purpose, a mission to heal other broken beings. "To Faith," Robert said, raising his glass in a toast that would have been unimaginable a year ago, "who taught us all that sometimes the ones who have suffered most have the most to give." "To Faith," they echoed, the German shepherd's ears perking up at the sound of her name repeated with such affection. As they began passing dishes around the table, the conversation flowing easily between them, Emily felt a contentment that went beyond happiness, a deep-rooted certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, surrounded by the family she needed, both human and canine. Outside, the summer twilight settled gently over the Peterson farm. In the barn, the rescued dogs rested more easily than they had in months or years, their broken spirits beginning to mend in this place of patience and understanding. In the fields, crops grew strong and soil enriched by fire, and in the farmhouse kitchen, a family once fractured by grief shared a meal and memories, their bonds strengthened by the journey through darkness into light. Faith rested her head on Emily's lap beneath the table, a warm, steady presence that had become the heartbeat of their shared life. The German shepherd's intelligent eyes, still bright despite the gray hairs now frosting her muzzle, seemed to hold wisdom beyond human understanding, the simple truth that love, once given freely, continues to multiply in ways no one could predict. "You know," Martha said thoughtfully as she served apple pie for dessert, "I was thinking we might have room for one more rescue. Sheriff Daniels mentioned a border collie mix they found abandoned out by the highway last week." Jim raised an eyebrow. "I thought you said we had enough dogs to last a lifetime." "Well," Martha sniffed, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, "that was before I saw how that empty stall in the barn was just collecting dust. Seems a waste of good space." Emily and Robert exchanged amused glances. Martha's gradual transformation from reluctant dog tolerator to active advocate for their four-legged residents had been one of the most unexpected developments of the past year. "I think that's a fine idea," Robert said, surprising them all with his immediate agreement. "In fact, I've been thinking it might be time for me to adopt a dog of my own." The apartment gets pretty quiet when Emily's here at the farm. Emily nearly dropped her fork in astonishment. "Really, Dad? You want a dog?" Robert smiled, the expression coming more naturally to him these days. "I've learned a lot this past year about the healing power of animals, and about taking chances on love, even when it seems risky." He glanced at Faith. "Besides, I've got a pretty good teacher now in what to look for in a canine companion." As the conversation turned to the possibilities of Robert's potential adoption, a smaller dog for apartment living perhaps, or maybe one of the rehabilitation cases that needed a quieter environment, Emily felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. This was the gift Faith had brought them, not just the rescue of a wounded animal, but the rescue of a wounded family. Through her courage, her loyalty, her unfailing love despite past betrayals, the German Shepherd had shown them all how to live more fully, how to trust again, how to find purpose in helping others heal. Later that evening, as fireflies began to dance in the gathering darkness outside, Emily sat on the porch steps with Faith beside her. Her father and grandparents remained inside, their voices drifting through the screen door in comfortable conversation. Hope had joined them on the porch, her smaller form curled contentedly against Faith's side. "We did it, Faith," Emily whispered, stroking the dog's silky ear. "We saved each other, just like I promised." Faith's amber eyes, wise and gentle, met Emily's gaze with what seemed like perfect understanding. The German Shepherd had come to them broken, betrayed by humans who should have honored her service and sacrifice. Emily had been broken too, a child unable to process the enormity of her loss, trapped in silence and fear. Together, they had found a way forward, not erasing the scars of the past, but transforming them into something meaningful, even beautiful. The Peterson Farm Canine Rehabilitation Center, as it was now officially known, had already helped dozens of dogs find new purpose and loving homes. Emily's asthma attacks had decreased dramatically with the steady routine of farm life and the emotional stability Faith provided. and Robert had begun to speak of Caroline more freely, sharing memories that kept her presence alive in their hearts, rather than sealed away in silence. From the darkest moments, a dying dog trapped in barbed wire, a family on the verge of losing everything, a father and daughter unable to reach across the gulf of shared grief, had come unexpected light. Not perfect happiness, for life was too complex for such simplicity, but something perhaps more valuable: resilience, purpose, and the deep contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you are meant to be, doing what you were meant to do. As the first stars appeared in the Texas sky, Emily made a silent wish of gratitude rather than request, for faith beside her, for hope at their feet, for courage and love fulfilling their purposes in the wider world, for her father finding his way back to joy, for her grandparents secure in their home, for the future stretching before them all, uncertain as all futures must be, but faced together rather than alone. Faith sighed contentedly, settling her head on Emily's lap in a gesture that had become as familiar and necessary as breathing. Together, girl and dog watched the night deepen over the farm that had become their shared salvation, their hearts beating in the steady rhythm of love that asks nothing and gives everything, the greatest miracle of all. Sometimes life's deepest wounds become our greatest blessings in disguise. Emily and Faith's journey reminds us that it's never too late to heal, to forgive, or to start again. Like Robert, many of us have closed our hearts after loss, thinking it's safer to avoid new attachments than risk more pain. But Faith, a military hero who had every reason to distrust humans, showed that courage isn't about avoiding hurt, it's about remaining open to love despite it. The Peterson farm's transformation from a place of fading hope to a sanctuary of healing mirrors the journey many of us face in our own lives. Whether you're dealing with retirement, loss of a spouse, strained family relationships, or simply wondering about your purpose in these golden years, remember that your most meaningful chapter might still be unwritten. Your wisdom and experience, even your scars, could be exactly what someone else needs for their healing journey. Has there been a faith in your life? A person, pet, or unexpected event that helped you find new purpose when you thought your best days were behind you? Or is there someone in your life who needs the gift of your presence and understanding right now? Share your story below. Your words might be the hope someone else is searching for today.